The story begins in a violent sea where a brutal battle unfolds between a man and a dragon. Suspended in midair, the man grips his spear and throws it toward the dragon. The spear strikes the dragon's head, and purple lightning instantly spreads across the surroundings. Looking at what had happened, the man lets out a faint laugh in disbelief. He wonders if the only one who could have come out of such chaos was himself, and questions whether he is still truly human. Both of them crash onto the ground. The dragon turns toward the man and releases a deafening roar. The impact alone throws the man backward. Staring at him, the dragon recalls his past and laments that only one more year remained before his ascension. After living as a spiritual beast for 999 years, he never imagined making such a mistake and ending up killing his own vessel. Unable to understand it, he questions what the man hated enough to throw everything away and asks what he ultimately gained from it. Kneeling on the ground beneath the rain, the man remains silent for a moment before answering that he never wanted anything in return. He simply repaid the kindness he once received, and that alone was enough for him. Then he quietly asks if this is enough now. At that moment, a mysterious voice echoes. The dragon reacts immediately and questions whose name was being called. Suddenly, a massive explosion erupts. Flames spread in every direction and destroy the entire area. Believing his end had finally come, the dragon wonders if he was only meant to disappear like that. Yet amid the destruction, he hears a strange sound. A moment later, realization strikes. He was still alive. He could feel his heartbeat. Although he had lost his vessel, some power still remained within his body. As he senses it, another voice echoes and tells him that while the energy in his dantian had vanished, power still remained stored in his body. Confused, the dragon wonders where he is. Looking around, he notices a wall and realizes he is trapped. He raises his hand and gathers the remaining power into it before striking downward. Even with his dantian sealed, he refuses to submit. The attack breaks through the wall. Breathing heavily, the dragon steps into another place. The area is filled with valuable treasures and unusual objects. He realizes he has almost no strength left, but more importantly, he cannot understand where he has ended up. Even at a glance, the place is overflowing with rare items, making him wonder who could possess such an enormous collection of treasure. As he looks around, one object catches his attention. Among all the riches stands a stone with words engraved on it. It reads, "Here lies a treasure that exists only once in the entire world. Even if we may never meet again, in that unchanging place, I wish for your happiness." The dragon quietly looks at the monument and realizes it was dedicated to a child. He wonders if this entire place had been created to raise that child. After a brief pause, he decides that he should at least offer a short prayer. Then, squish, the dragon brought his hands together and prepared to offer prayer. But as soon as he did, he noticed something strange. He stared at his hands in confusion, then quickly examined the rest of his body. Touching his face, he froze. Something was wrong. His body had become small and round. Looking at himself in disbelief, he realized he had turned into a hatchling. He couldn't accept it. There was no way this tiny, helpless creature could actually be him. After calming down, he reached a conclusion. This must be what humans called reincarnation. Although he still didn't fully understand what had happened, he decided there was no point dwelling on it. For now, he needed to focus on what he could do in this situation. There might be something in this place that could help him. The hatchling stood up and began exploring. As he wandered through the treasure-filled area, he eventually grew bored and sat on top of a box. Nearby, he noticed a bottle and started examining the surrounding objects. There were treasures that radiated power the moment they were touched and artifacts infused with strange effects. To him, whoever collected all of this clearly had unusual tastes. One item carried a petrification curse just for being seen. Another condemned its target to endless starvation. There was even a bottle that stole a person's voice and bound their legs. Compared to the others, some barely qualified as curses at all. Looking around, he wondered why such a small space had been filled with nothing but dangerous objects and questioned whether someone intended to balance opposing energies together. Then, something rolled down from above. A small stone landed in front of him. Curious, he picked it up and looked upward. His eyes widened. Above him stood an enormous mountain of treasure. As he stared at it, Something immediately caught his attention. He had found something valuable. Excited, the hatchling climbed the treasure mountain. After reaching the top, he discovered a gemstone attached to an ornamental cup. Holding it in both hands, he inspected it carefully. These weren't ordinary gems. They were gemstones embedded with power, similar to enchanted weapons. From one of them, he sensed a darkness similar to the power he once possessed in his previous life. He immediately decided to keep it. The ornament attached to it was getting in the way, so he tried pulling the gemstone free. It didn't move. Even with his tiny body, he kept trying. Slowly, it started loosening. He strained harder and harder, refusing to let go. Then, the gemstone suddenly came free. But the hatchling lost his balance. Holding the gem tightly, he slipped and fell backward down the treasure mountain. After crashing to the ground, he slowly stood up. Back in his previous life, something like this wouldn't even have left a scratch. Still, at least the gemstone was safe. Then a blue light appeared in front of him. Space began twisting. A portal slowly opened. The hatchling immediately sensed overwhelming pressure coming from beyond it. A powerful presence was approaching. He couldn't even say for certain whether his former self could have gained the upper hand against something like this. Even so, thinking back to his previous life, to the curses carried across generations and the misfortune he had endured, he decided not to back down. From the portal, a giant golden dragon emerged. Its blue eyes calmly observed the surroundings. The hatchling stared back. Was this supposed to intimidate him through sheer presence? If so, then he refused to give in. Imagining the form he once possessed, he gathered himself and tried to roar back. But instead of the overwhelming roar he expected, only a small, awkward cry came out. The hatchling froze. What was that sound supposed to be? The golden dragon looked surprised. Then it reached forward, gently lifted the hatchling by the tail, and noticed something. The hatchling had touched a serpent. Looking closer, the golden dragon realized this was only a hatchling. Seeing the tiny dragon trembling in fear, the golden dragon's appearance began to change. The golden dragon completed her transformation into a beautiful woman. She had long blonde hair, wore a flowing white dress, and gently held the hatchling in her hands. Looking at him, she softly asked whether this form felt more comfortable and introduced herself as Christina. The hatchling stared at her in silence. She was telling him her name. Christina carefully placed him down and, after thinking for a moment, asked whether he had eaten anything and if he was feeling all right. Although the hatchling couldn't speak, he could understand her. He realized she was asking if he was hungry. Back when he was an imugi, going an entire month without eating wouldn't have been difficult. But before he could think further, Christina noticed the gemstone beside him. Curious, she reached toward it. The hatchling reacted instantly. He grabbed the gemstone in his mouth and jumped backward. What was she trying to do? But the moment he landed, a strange sound echoed. He froze and looked at himself. His stomach had started growling. No matter how much he tried to stay composed, his instincts were beginning to overpower his reason. He needed to stay focused. Christina quietly raised her hand and used her power. A bottle appeared. She opened it and held it out to him. The hatchling looked at the bottle, then his nose caught the scent. His eyes widened. Milk! Immediately, he dropped the gemstone and stared at the bottle in Christina's hand. What exactly was this dragon doing? For a moment, he hesitated. Should he accept it or not? Seeing that he wasn't moving, Christina calmly said that if he didn't want it, she would put it away. The hatchling instantly jumped forward. She was going to take it away. Without hesitation, he grabbed the bottle. He began drinking. Christina quietly watched him and remarked that he must have been starving. After finishing every drop, the hatchling looked up with complete satisfaction. He couldn't believe it. How could something as simple as milk taste this good? Smiling, Christina asked if he liked it. The hatchling made a small, embarrassed sound in response. Christina smiled gently and reached out her hand. She called him Little One and asked if he was willing, would he come with her? She told him there was far more delicious food waiting out in the world. And beyond that, there were countless wonderful things he had never seen before. The hatchling stayed silent. He thought carefully for a while. Then, after considering her offer, he decided to accept Christina's proposal. The hatchling picked up the gemstone from the ground and held onto Christina's dress. Although he hadn't understood every word she said, he could tell she was asking him to come with her. She didn't seem dangerous. and there was nothing left in this place besides treasure. More importantly, the instincts of this young body were becoming harder to ignore. Trying to survive alone without someone to protect him would be risky. Of course, he insisted to himself that his decision had absolutely nothing to do with how good the milk tasted. Seeing his response, Christina gently picked him up and held him close. With visible emotion in her voice, she welcomed him. She admitted that she had once wondered if he would ever hatch and thanked him for surviving. Then she thanked him for being born as her child. The hatchling looked directly into her eyes. She was thanking him simply for existing. It felt strange, but not unpleasant. At the same time, he couldn't help thinking about the child she believed she was speaking to. The original soul was most likely gone. Quietly, the hatchling lifted the gemstone and offered it to her. Christina reached out and asked if it was a gift, or if he simply wanted her to hold on to it. Instead of letting go, the hatchling wrapped his tiny body around her. He decided he couldn't let his guardian stay sad. Christina smiled and hugged him back. As she began walking toward the exit, she gently wondered if he was trying to comfort her and found it unbelievable that something so small could be this adorable. She promised that she would take good care of him from now on. As they left, the hatchling looked back one last time toward the stone monument. Quietly, he made a promise in his heart. He thanked whoever had given him this life and wished that they would find peace in their next one. This time, he would not die helplessly again. He would become strong enough that no one could ever hurt him. And to do that, he would use every possible opportunity available to him. Absolutely everything. Time passed. The hatchling slept peacefully. Then one morning, he slowly opened his eyes. Standing on the bed, he let out a small howl before sitting quietly and looking toward the sunlight pouring through the window. It was time for his morning meditation. He climbed down, sat on the floor, closed his eyes, and focused on controlling his power. At first, adapting to this unfamiliar body had been difficult, but little by little, he became used to it. As he trained, he realized something unusual. Unlike before, energy naturally gathered in his heart, even without breathing techniques. At first, he thought something had gone wrong, but after watching Christina use magic, he realized this was simply how power worked in this world. That discovery actually worked in his favor. Since he didn't need to train his middle mana reservoir, he could focus entirely on the lower reservoir, the place where the purest mana flowed. Combined with a newborn body untouched by impurities, the results were more than satisfying. But there was one thing bothering him. Whenever he turned around, a strange creature was always floating nearby, watching everything he did. And every time he tried leaving the room, the creature would immediately report to Christina. Moments later, she would appear and stop him, reminding him that it was dangerous outside. Apparently, because she worried about leaving him alone, she had summoned this so-called spirit to watch over him. Thanks to that, he couldn't do any physical training that might attract attention. And every attempt to sneak outside ended exactly the same way. The spirit would run off, and Christina would return. The hatchling looked inward toward his core and felt his inner energy circulating steadily. Looking upward, he decided it was finally time. He would test it. Teleportation magic. But just as he prepared himself, he remembered that spirit was still there, floating nearby and watching him from behind. The hatchling glanced back. Trying something now would be difficult. If only that spirit were an opponent he could confront directly, things would have been easier. Instead, he would need another approach. Sooner or later, he had to come up with a plan. Then he opened his mouth and tried making a sound. Only an awkward cry came out. His expression darkened. The problem wasn't his technique, it was his mouth. The structure of this tiny body made proper pronunciation impossible. Until he grew bigger, fixing it wouldn't be easy. To make things worse, the summoned spirit started copying him. The hatchling immediately became embarrassed. He wanted it to stop mimicking him. And even worse, it somehow looked like it was praising him. At this rate, embarrassment alone might defeat him. Just then, he sensed a familiar mana current. Christina. A portal opened. Christina stepped out and smiled the moment she saw him. She asked whether he had been behaving well. The hatchling instantly ran toward her. His thoughts were much simpler. It was time for food. Christina sat down and gently raised a finger. Seeing him come over to greet her, she praised him for being such a good child. The hatchling silently corrected her. He only came for the meal. Christina gently pinched his cheeks and asked whether milk alone was enough or if he wanted meat. The moment he heard that word, his eyes lit up. Meat. But after checking his mouth, Christina noticed that his teeth hadn't fully grown in yet. The hatchling stared at her in disbelief. Of course he wanted some. Christina laughed softly and said he understood her surprisingly well. She even called him the smartest hatchling she had ever seen. The hatchling stood proudly and looked toward the spirit. Naturally, he was a 999-year-old divine beast. Still, his act seemed to be working. Christina didn't suspect anything. Looking amused, she picked him up and asked whether he wanted to be held. The hatchling hugged her. Not because he wanted affection, he wanted the milk. But maintaining appearances seemed necessary. Christina smiled and hugged him back. Then she noticed him staring at her with obvious expectation. Finally understanding, she handed over a bottle. Calling him adorable, she apologized for losing track of time and offered him his favorite milk. The hatchling immediately took it and began drinking. Finally, that was what he had been waiting for. Every bit of acting had been worth it. Usually when he ate like this, Christina would sit nearby and talk. Normally, listening to other people's stories wasn't something he enjoyed. In his previous life as an imugi, he barely had any friends. But even if Christina didn't realize it, he understood every word she said. And whenever she spoke to him, he could see her expression become lighter and more relaxed. Because of those conversations, there were now very few words he didn't understand. And along the way, he had gathered quite a lot of information about this world. After he finished drinking, Christina called to him softly. Then she smiled and made a request. Could he do something cute for her? The hatchling quietly put the bottle aside. Then, he gave her his cutest expression. Even if he had once lived for 999 years, acting cute for a little milk wasn't impossible. After all, one should return what they receive. Christina immediately pinched his soft cheeks and called him far too adorable. The hatchling turned away shyly. At least she seemed happy. And he couldn't exactly act cold towards someone who had shown him kindness. Christina gently placed her hand on his head. She told him she hoped he would always be happy. She hoped he would live a wonderful life in his own way. Hearing those words spoken with complete sincerity, he finally admitted it. Christina was genuinely warm and kind. Anyone could tell just by watching the way she spoke and acted. 5 minutes earlier, she had urged him to eat well and grow stronger. Kindness like this, he wasn't used to receiving it, so he didn't really know how to return it. Then suddenly, a memory surfaced. Back in his previous life, someone had once said something similar. The scene shifted. A beautiful woman with long white hair and fox-like ears lay calmly on a stone. Looking toward him in his human form, she quietly asked whether he enjoyed training. The memory continued. Back then, when he was still in human form, he looked at the beautiful fox woman in surprise. Her sudden question had caught him completely off guard. Seeing that he didn't answer, she looked at him again and reminded him of something he once said, that he had isolated himself all this time for the sake of ascension. Then she asked something simple. Was he actually happy living that way? When he still didn't respond, she called him a fool. Confused, he calmly answered that their goals were simply different. The woman let out a small laugh. That, she said, was exactly why he was a fool. The protagonist looked back at her, unable to understand the expression she was giving him. She stared at him quietly before asking if he had ever truly been happy. Did he even know what it felt like to be cared for, or to be genuinely loved? After a brief silence, he replied that none of those things seemed necessary. He was someone destined to become a dragon after ascension. He didn't have time for emotions like that. The woman smiled and called him cold, but she admitted that perhaps it was part of his charm. Then he asked if she wasn't the same. She was also standing on the edge of ascension as a celestial fox, yet she still couldn't let go of those seemingly trivial emotions. Unexpectedly, she declared that she was going to become human. The protagonist stared at her. She laughed and asked whether it sounded ridiculous. Then she explained. She had found someone she loved. Even after learning she was a gumaho, that person still loved her. And when someone loved you that deeply, wouldn't you naturally want to return that love? She said she hoped that one day he would understand that feeling too. Then she laughed again and added that someone as dense as him probably wouldn't even notice if that kind of person appeared in front of him. The protagonist quietly replied that something like that could never happen to him. Then he reminded her, if she became human, she would never be able to return here again. But instead of stopping her, in his own way, he wished she would live a good life. A life where she would be loved exactly as she deserved. And quietly, he admitted to himself that he had grown fond of her too. The woman suddenly looked at him with an emotional expression. Confused, he asked why she was making that face. Why wasn't she saying something sharp like usual? If she had something to say, she should just say it. Instead, she became flustered. Turning away, she started leaving. But before disappearing, she looked back with a smile and declared that she hated everything, even when she tried being nice. Then she called him a dense imugi. But quietly she thanked him. The memory ended. Back in the present, the hatchling slowly stood on his small legs and tried taking a step. He still didn't fully understand what she meant back then, but now he understood one thing. Returning affection. That was what she had been talking about. At that moment, a portal opened. Christina stepped out. She began speaking as if expecting to find him waiting quietly, then suddenly stopped. The hatchling began walking toward her. In his mind, he decided that this would be his way of returning her kindness, showing her how much he had grown, and maybe if she saw his progress, she would finally remove that glowing spirit constantly watching him. Christina stared in disbelief. He was already taking his first steps. Her expression completely changed. The hatchling froze. Was she crying? Instead, Christina rushed forward and hugged him tightly. Overwhelmed, she wondered what she was supposed to do with something this adorable. Then she immediately gave up trying to stay composed. After calming down, she carefully set him down again. Then she remembered something. She had brought something for him. She had almost forgotten. The hatchling immediately looked toward the bag she was carrying. Something for him? His thoughts reached one conclusion. Was it food? Christina opened the bag she had brought and carefully took something out. Holding it in her hand, she explained that it came from an immortal bird, then corrected herself. More precisely, it was a phoenix egg. The hatchling looked at it and imagined a crimson bird in his mind. It resembled one, but from what he remembered, creatures like that didn't hatch from eggs. Without hesitation, he grabbed the bag and turned away. After finding a spot to sit, he took out one of the phoenix eggs and started struggling to peel the shell. After several attempts, success. He finally cracked it open. Taking the first bite, he froze. It was incredible. Christina had actually expected him to reject the eggs. But after seeing how enthusiastically he ate them, she smiled and admitted she was relieved. She explained that they were considered a delicacy and had been roasted with the fire of a red dragon. She had worried he might not enjoy them. The hatchling happily continued eating. But it wasn't only the taste. Inside each egg, he could faintly sense traces of fire magic. Once he finished the first egg, Christina handed him a bottle of milk. She placed it beside him and gently told him not to rush. There was plenty more. Even with the hatchling's appetite, she said it was better to eat carefully. After finishing the milk, the hatchling moved on to a second phoenix egg. As he reached for another one inside the bag, something felt different. One egg stood out. It was unusually red and much harder than the others. He pulled his hand back. There was still plenty left anyway. He decided to leave that strange one for later. After finishing his meal, he stretched out and lay on the floor. The eggs were unbelievably soft, practically melting in his mouth. But then the consequences arrived. He had eaten far too much. Christina smiled and gently pinched his stomach before patting his head. Then she stood up. She laughed and said she never expected him to eat so much. At this rate, she would have to go get more. She promised she would return soon and told him to rest while she was gone. The hatchling raised a tiny hand and waved goodbye. Once she left, reality hit him. He couldn't believe he had overeaten. Digesting all of this was going to take time. A heavy wave of sleepiness quickly followed. The food coma was overwhelming. Eventually, he fell asleep. Some time later, a faint sound woke him. Slowly opening his eyes, the hatchling stood up on the bed. Looking toward the window, he noticed something. More phoenix eggs had been placed nearby inside a bucket. His eyes widened. He must have dozed off longer than expected. There was no one in the room. After staring at the eggs for a moment, he quietly made his decision. Using his tiny wings, he floated down and landed beside them. Wait, there were even more eggs. The hatchling stared at the bucket of eggs and quickly reached a conclusion. Christina must have stopped by while he was asleep. Looking at the pile, he hesitated. Maybe just one more. After that nap, he felt like everything had already been digested. And honestly, one more shouldn't hurt. This wasn't greed. He was simply trying to absorb more fire mana. That was all. As his eyes moved across the bucket, he stopped. One egg stood out. the unusually red one. Then he noticed something else. The summoned spirit wasn't anywhere in sight. The hatchling immediately made a decision. Sooner or later, he would have needed to deal with this situation anyway. And since he was alone, this was his chance. He raised one tiny hand and gathered his energy. Then he punched the egg. Nothing happened. Not even a crack. The hatchling slipped backward and landed on the floor. He stared in disbelief. Not a single scratch. Slowly getting back up, he decided that if the egg wanted to resist, then he would stop holding back. He really hadn't planned on using this much effort over a roasted egg, but just this once. The hatchling gathered power into both hands. Jumping upward, he imagined the overwhelming form he once possessed in his previous life. Then he attacked. The impact echoed. For a moment, nothing. Then, a crack appeared. Breathing heavily, the hatchling stared at it. He had done it. His power was still unmatched. Satisfied, he walked closer. After making him work this hard, he was finally going to find out how good this thing tasted. He reached out, then froze. Something inside moved. His expression changed instantly. Wait, what? The shell slowly opened. A tiny sound came from inside. Then a small bird emerged. The hatchling completely froze. The bird emerged from the cracked egg, flew straight toward the hatchling, and wrapped itself around him. The hatchling stood frozen. Looking at the tiny creature, he slowly realized something strange. The energy coming from it wasn't ordinary. It carried fire energy mixed together with his own power. The bird tilted its head and made a curious sound. The hatchling recalled the moment he attacked the egg. Back then, his power hadn't disappeared. It had been completely absorbed, which meant all the energy he had gathered until now had gone directly into this little creature. Feeling drained, he lay on the floor and looked at the phoenix. Did this tiny thing have any idea how difficult it had been to collect all that power? The bird slowly walked toward him on its tiny legs and made soft sounds. The hatchling looked at it with confusion. What was it even trying to say? The bird chirped again. Curious, the hatchling reached out and touched its head. Then he stopped. Why was it acting so attached? Were phoenixes usually like this? Then a realization struck him. A phoenix. A bird. Among avian divine beasts, there had once been creatures with similar instincts. He decided to confirm it. The hatchling stood up and walked away. Immediately, the bird followed. He walked faster. The bird followed. He started running in circles. The bird kept chasing after him. Eventually, he stopped. It was real. Imprinting. The bird continued chirping happily. Meanwhile, exhaustion finally caught up with him. After losing so much energy, he felt completely worn out. He slowly flew back toward the bed. If he ignored the bird, it would eventually get tired and stop. That was his plan. The hatchling settled down on the bed, but the bird remained below, calling endlessly. At first, the cries became weaker. Then, he realized something. Those weren't ordinary sounds. The bird was crying. The hatchling looked annoyed. Did this clueless chick realize how much energy he had lost because of it? At that moment, Christina returned carrying a basket full of eggs. She had come back later than expected and hurried in case the baby had become hungry. As she opened the door and stepped inside, she stopped. Eggshells were scattered throughout the room. Hearing the sounds and seeing the empty shells, she assumed he had waited, eaten everything, and fallen asleep. Then her eyes moved toward the bed. She froze. Beside the sleeping hatchling, there was something else. A small bird. Her expression changed. Could that be a phoenix egg? Christina stared quietly at the small bird. The little phoenix noticed her immediately. Thinking she might harm the hatchling, it spread its tiny wings and stepped in front of him protectively. Christina watched in silence. She could clearly feel it, pure fire mana mixed with darkness. And beyond that, the unmistakable aura of a dragon. There was no way she could mistake it. To think that a newborn was already carrying such a burden. A sacred firebird that once roamed the garden of the gods, now standing guard over the last black dragon. To her, it felt as though she was witnessing the flow of destiny taking shape. Christina slowly sat down in front of the bird. But there was a problem. It wouldn't even let her get close. And suppressing something so young by force didn't feel right. Just then, the hatchling sat up. Without hesitation, he reached from behind, picked up the phoenix, and moved it aside. Don't be rude. She was his benefactor. Then he looked at the bird again in disbelief. What kind of bird hatched from a roasted egg? Christina smiled faintly. There was only one phoenix born each generation, which meant this child had become the phoenix of this era. The hatchling quietly accepted the conclusion, but Christina continued thinking. Normally, another phoenix would only appear after the previous one disappeared, and even then it could take up to 100 years. Yet the phoenix of the current generation should still exist. Something didn't make sense. Had something gone wrong in the world, or was this an omen? A phoenix carrying darkness. Even if both were still hatchlings, this wasn't something she could ignore. Christina summoned Rai. Then she decided she would visit Pasias, elder of the Red Dragons. Since he governed fire and was also raising a hatchling, she wanted to discuss this unusual child with him. After thanking Rai, she turned toward the hatchling and gently asked whether he would be all right. The hatchling immediately raised his hand and waved. But internally, his thoughts were very different. Christina leaving meant free time. Meanwhile, Christina quietly reflected. She was slightly worried about leaving the three of them alone. Yet somehow, she felt this child would be fine. It wasn't simply because he was clever or mature. It felt like he already possessed values and judgment of his own. And more than that, his mana control was unusual. Most hatchlings used mana recklessly. But this child controlled mana exactly as intended. Precise, complex, deliberate. Christina smiled. She already knew he wouldn't be an ordinary genius. Still, she couldn't help wondering. Before her master entrusted this child to her, had something been done to him? Then she quietly dismissed the thought. It didn't matter. No matter what kind of child he was for now, she was his guardian and his teacher. Before leaving, she promised she would return soon. Then she remembered something. A young man with red hair appeared in her thoughts, well-dressed, sitting by a window and reading quietly. Pasias' son. She had heard he was an exceptionally gifted prodigy. Maybe he could help this child, and perhaps the two of them might even become good friends. Though judging from her expression, she didn't seem entirely convinced that would actually happen. Christina summoned Rai and gave the spirit a simple order. If anything happened, Rai should report it immediately. Then she sat in front of the hatchling and gently reminded him to stay with Rai while she was gone. The hatchling obediently responded. Internally, however, he had a completely different opinion. Why wouldn't she just leave already? Christina pinched his cheeks and kissed him before standing up. At once, the hatchling froze. Even the phoenix became restless and seemed to complain that it wanted attention too. Smiling, Christina promised she would return as quickly as possible. Then she left. The door closed. The hatchling stared at it for a moment. She was really gone. Silence. Then his excitement exploded. Finally, freedom. He stretched his body and climbed down. If he were a real baby, staying in a crib all day would make sense. But he wasn't, and he certainly wasn't hibernating. He hadn't even been able to train properly because of all the restrictions. At least now, it seemed Christina didn't mind him moving around a little. Then the phoenix called out. The hatchling turned around. The bird looked ready to follow him. He immediately objected, but after thinking for a moment, he decided it would be more troublesome to let the bird run around freely. So he picked it up in his mouth and placed it on top of his head. Problem solved. Carrying the phoenix, he walked toward the exit. A door. Looking upward, he judged the distance. If he jumped, he should be able to reach it. After preparing himself, he leaped. Success. He grabbed the handle. Then he tried opening it. Locked. The hatchling turned toward Rai. So that was why the spirit had stayed so calm. But he wasn't just any hatchling. Quietly gathering mana, he used his power. Then the door opened. Standing at the entrance, he slowly turned back toward Rai. What mattered most now wasn't escaping. It was Rai's reaction. Would this little guard call Christina? The hatchling watched Rai closely. This reaction, no reaction at all. Rai simply allowed it. The hatchling stared in confusion. Why had he agreed so easily? Still, that worked perfectly. Without wasting time, he pushed the door open and stepped outside. Then he stopped. His eyes widened. The space beyond was far larger than he had imagined. After staring for a while, he quietly sat down. Now he understood. Despite being overprotective, Christina never sealed everything completely. She must have assumed that no matter how much a hatchling wandered, there was only so far one could actually go. The hatchling looked toward Rai and continued walking. But honestly, at this pace, exploring properly would be impossible. Just as he thought, moving around without teleportation magic was incredibly inconvenient. Fortunately, he had prepared for this. All this time, he had been carefully observing Christina. Every time she used teleportation, he memorized the flow of energy. Now he focused. The surrounding mana responded. It felt strangely natural, almost like the mana around him belonged to his own body. As his senses spread outward, it felt as though he could perceive every trace of mana throughout the lair. At this level, it should work. Now the question was, where should he go? He glanced at Rai. Even if someone tried stopping him now, it was already too late. Quietly gathering his energy, he activated teleportation. In an instant, the world changed. The hatchling appeared near the mountains. His eyes sparkled. So this was outside the lair. He already knew this world was different, but seeing it directly still felt unbelievable. Then, he remembered something. He had teleported into open air. Immediately, he began falling. The little phoenix panicked and tried pulling him upward. The hatchling realized why. He intentionally chose empty space to avoid getting stuck in terrain. At least the phoenix and Rai had come along. The bird cried out. The hatchling answered weakly. Then, crash. They landed. Fortunately, they weren't high enough to properly spread their wings. The hatchling sat up and looked around. At least all three had made it. Then he looked toward Rai. Why was this spirit so worked up? He and the bird sat quietly while he thought. Christina always used teleportation so casually. Was it really that shocking? Then, his expression slowly changed. Wait, if teleportation magic were something every hatchling could use, there was no way Christina would have left him alone with only a tiny glowing spirit watching him. This situation, was it still under control? His expression stiffened. Then he remembered. It was too late. He had already used magic he couldn't easily hide anymore. The hatchling looked at the phoenix. Overthinking wouldn't solve anything. Gently placing his hand on the bird's head, he decided on something simpler. First, figure out where they actually were. So the hatchling began exploring. Together with the phoenix and Rai, he wandered through the area. They lay on the grass and watched ants carrying food. They leaned over the water and watched fish moving beneath the surface. They crossed the river and continued forward. Eventually, the hatchling climbed a tree to get a better view. Reaching the top, his eyes widened. In the distance, there it was. Christina's lair. He stared quietly. So this was what it looked like from outside. Massive currents of mana swirled around it endlessly. From this distance, it looked as though the lair and the mountain itself had fused together. After taking in the sight, he nodded to himself. That was enough. Pointing toward the lair, he signaled that it was time to head back. Maybe the teleportation had been accidental, but at least he hadn't abandoned his supervisor while sneaking out. As he climbed down, another thought appeared. If he showed Christina that he could use teleportation and also showed enough restraint not to misuse it, maybe she would praise his talent. Maybe she would even help him grow stronger. He sat quietly for a moment. Rai floated nearby, creating an image of him. The hatchling made an awkward face. Hopefully he hadn't acted too confidently and made himself suspicious instead. Still, everything would probably work out. Then he stopped. Something caught his attention. A scent. The hatchling lifted his head. Wait, what was that smell? His eyes lit up. He looked toward the source. Then suddenly, he jumped forward excitedly. Found it. The hatchling's eyes lit up. Wild ginseng. A heavenly elixir. Excited, he sat beside the plant and carefully observed it. As expected from something growing on a sacred mountain, the energy coming from it felt completely different. If he ate this, maybe he could recover at least a little of his strength. He reached out. Then suddenly, Rai moved in front of him and blocked the way. The hatchling froze. What now? Rai continued trying to stop him. Annoyed, the hatchling pushed back. Those irritating little guardians. Why were they always interfering? Before Rai could react again, the phoenix suddenly charged in and knocked Rai's side. The hatchling's eyes widened. Seriously, what a reliable little bird. Without hesitation, he grabbed the heavenly elixir. This was his chance. He immediately started eating. It was too large to swallow in one bite, but that didn't matter. Once it was in his mouth, it belonged to him. That was the plan. Then, something felt wrong. The hatchling froze. The phoenix suddenly panicked and rushed toward him. Its cries became urgent. The hatchling's expression changed. Wait, this wasn't the heavenly elixir he thought it was. His strength started fading rapidly. If this continued, he was going to pass out. As his consciousness blurred, he looked toward Rai and the bird. This was bad. He had dragged them into this. Then, a soft green light surrounded him. From behind the bushes, someone appeared. A beautiful woman stepped forward. She had blonde hair and wore a short olive-green hooded cloak with worn edges covering her shoulders and upper back. Dark green wraps extended along her arms. Using magic, she stopped the hatchling's falling body in midair. Then she opened her bag and took out medicine. With precise control, she floated it toward him, gently opened his mouth, and fed it to him. Warm energy spread through his body. Slowly, his consciousness returned. The hatchling opened his eyes. What was this? His vision was still blurry. He could see someone standing in front of him, but he couldn't make out who it was. His strength still hadn't fully returned. Immediately, the phoenix enro rushed over. The little bird held on to him and started crying. The hatchling looked at it weakly. Just a little longer. He only needed to rest for a moment. There was no need to cry. Just for a little while. At the same time, far away, Christina entered a cave. Quietly stepping inside, she prepared to greet the one waiting within. It had been a long time. Seated ahead of her was a red dragon. She addressed him by name. Pasías. The dragon turned toward her and acknowledged the visit. The head of the gold dragons arriving without notice was unusual. Then, in the next moment, the red dragon transformed. His form changed into that of a handsome man with red hair dressed in dark clothing. Watching calmly, Christina realized something. The fact that he allowed such a breach of etiquette meant he had probably already decided whether he would accept a request. Pasías smiled faintly and remarked that he could only hope the reason for the visit would justify his time. Christina politely apologized and explained that the matter was sensitive. Pasías dismissed the apology. She had always been proper. Then he asked her to speak. Christina immediately revealed the reason. A black dragon hatchling had been born. Pasías rose from his seat in shock. Christina calmly added that she still had not reported the matter to the Lord. That only made Pasías more curious. If so, why come to him first? Christina folded her hands and explained. The child was still young. He needed time to grow, experience the world, and develop his own identity. Behind her, the image of a dark figure with glowing red eyes lingered in her thoughts. Until then, she wanted Pasías to become a source of support for the child and keep Lord Isa from interfering. Pasías became serious. Was the child truly worth that much effort? Then Christina revealed something else. The child had revived a new phoenix. Pasías immediately reacted. That shouldn't have been possible. The current generation's phoenix should still exist. Christina agreed. That was exactly why this case was extraordinary. Pasías slammed his fist onto the table. If the Lord learned about this, he would either bend the child to his will or eliminate him entirely if he viewed him as a threat. Then he paused and smiled. The more he thought about it, the more clever Christina seemed. She came knowing he wouldn't reject the proposal. Christina simply answered that she trusted him to make the wise decision. Pasías admitted that coming to him first had been a smart move. As the sole heir of the dark lineage, if the child became the firstborn, he would become more than a son. He would become an elder. Building ties between that child and his own successor would benefit everyone. After making his decision, Pasías promised to send his son to Rai. His child would pass on everything possible, including the education expected of a successor. Christina respectfully thanked Elder Pasías and prepared to leave. Pasías smiled and called it a worthwhile conversation. As Christina left, one thought crossed her mind. That arrogant lord. She could already imagine his expression when he realized there were things that would not go according to his plans. Stepping out of the cave, Christina stood at the edge of a cliff and spread her wings. Then she quietly reflected. Still, Pasías wasn't any different. There were things that wouldn't go his way either. Her thoughts turned to his only heir, prediction. She had heard the father and son had been at odds lately. Maybe this meeting would be good for him as well. Then Christina's thoughts returned to the hatchling. She should head back. Thinking about it more, she suddenly wondered whether the child was hungry. Maybe she should bring milk, then she froze. A signal. Right. Her expression immediately changed. Something was wrong. An emergency. Without hesitation, Christina opened a portal and teleported. The moment she arrived, she called out urgently. Then she stopped. Landing on the ground, she rushed toward the hatchling. Immediately, the little phoenix spread its wings and stepped in front of him protectively. Christina hurried forward anyway and carefully picked the hatchling up in her arms. Christina's heart sank as she reached the hatchling. Holding him carefully, she looked around in confusion. Why were they outside the lair? What had happened? Rai immediately showed her what remained of the plant. The moment Christina saw it, her expression changed. Mandrake. He swallowed a whole. Mandrake was dangerous even under normal conditions, and everything living in this region had absorbed dragon mana for generations. Then she looked back at the hatchling. A child barely a month old had somehow found and eaten a mandrake that had been growing for hundreds of years. As she examined him, she sensed a faint trace of unfamiliar magic. Then she understood. Her thoughts shifted to someone else. Riz. Young, yet known as the most gifted among the younger dragons. And as Rune's daughter, exposing the child's existence wasn't ideal. Still, the hatchling survived because of it, so perhaps this should be considered a blessing instead. Christina gently hugged the hatchling. Quietly, she admitted this had been her mistake. She thought Rai alone would be enough because the hatchling shouldn't have been capable of leaving the lair. Yet somehow, this child had used teleportation magic, succeeded, escaped, and then immediately ate a mandrake. At this rate, he was going to become quite the troublesome child. At that moment, the hatchling slowly opened his eyes. That voice. His eyes widened. Christina. She looked relieved and softly asked if he was feeling better. Then she apologized. She should have been more careful. Her emotions spilled over as she held him tightly. The hatchling quietly listened. It really must have frightened her. And that made sense. She genuinely cared about him. Without saying anything, the hatchling hugged her back. In his own way, he apologized for acting on his own. Christina took a breath and made a decision. For now, they were going back. His body had suffered too much. Back inside the room, the hatchling sat on the bed and examined himself. Internal injuries. Chaotic energy. But he was alive. That was what mattered. No matter how familiar parts of this world sometimes felt, he finally understood. This was completely different from his previous life. Taking a deep breath, he decided to be more careful from now on. At least all his training hadn't been meaningless. Reflection could wait. For now, he focused on absorbing the energy that had entered his body. Then, a small buzzing sound interrupted him. He opened one eye and looked toward the phoenix. What now? The bird looked back. Then suddenly, the hatchling realized something. This little thing had been crying the whole time. He let out a quiet laugh. Really, what a strange creature. With slight embarrassment, he reached out and patted the bird's head. There was no need to cry. At worst, it had only been an upset stomach. Then another thought appeared. Even though this wasn't their own suffering, someone had worried and hurt alongside him. Back in his previous life, even if someone had done that, he probably never would have understood how precious it was. Looking at his hand, he quietly admitted it wasn't a bad feeling. Then he noticed something. A faint light. His eyes widened. What was this? Slowly, he raised his hand and stared. Could this be purification energy? The hatchling suddenly became alarmed. Looking at the water forming in his hand, a thought immediately crossed his mind. No way. Could this actually be purification energy? With wide eyes, he carefully tasted the water. The moment he confirmed it, excitement appeared on his face. Just as he expected, this water could neutralize poison. Not only that, it was also filling his dantian with fire energy. Slowly, he turned and looked at the phoenix. The little bird stared back innocently. The hatchling reached out with both hands and rubbed the bird's head. This little thing was turning out to be much more useful than he originally expected. At that moment, Christina entered the room. Seeing him awake, she asked whether he had rested well. She looked him over and said that although he seemed fine now, the whole experience must have been frightening. She carefully picked him up and explained that it must have been difficult for someone who was still only a hatchling. Still, once he grew older, something like a mandragora would no longer be dangerous. The hatchling quietly reassured himself. He would recover completely soon enough. But Christina's expression remained serious. Even after hearing Rai's report, she still found it difficult to believe. Teleportation magic alone had already been shocking. But recovering internal injuries this quickly, even with Riz's help, this level of healing simply shouldn't have been possible. As she thought quietly, the image of a dark eye seemed to linger in her mind. This child was far too extraordinary to grow up as an ordinary hatchling. And if Lord Isha ever learned about it, the hatchling looked at her and became nervous. Why did she suddenly look so serious? Then another thought appeared. Was she beginning to suspect something strange about him? If necessary, maybe he could blame everything on the phoenix. Christina gently set him down. Then she held his tiny hand and said she wanted to give him something. An inheritance spell. The hatchling became curious. Inheritance magic. A blessing built through an ancient language and granted by the gods to intelligent beings of this world. A spell created to plant the foundation of a dragon's knowledge. Through it, knowledge and abilities from a predecessor could be inherited, awakened, and developed. But the amount inherited depended on the recipient's mental maturity. Because of that, the burden on young hatchlings was enormous. And the most dangerous part, even harmful thoughts could be passed down depending on the predecessor. Christina sat on the floor and explained that inheritance magic was rarely used because of those strict conditions. And there was another limitation. An inheritance spell could only be used once in a lifetime. She looked directly at him and asked whether he could trust her. This wasn't only powerful magic, it was painful and dangerous. He would have to entrust everything to her. After staying quiet for a moment, Christina smiled and handed him a bottle of milk. Then she admitted something honestly. She had wanted him to experience a more ordinary childhood, the kind of experiences someone could only have while young. The hatchling quietly stood and walked toward her with his tiny legs. Later, the hatchling and the phoenix fell asleep. Christina remained beside them. She gently placed her hand on the hatchling and quietly thought about those experiences she originally hoped he would have. Looking at Christina, the hatchling quietly thought to himself. From his previous life, he understood. He understood the warmth in her kindness and the sincerity behind her concern. Sometimes life became harsher than anyone expected. Things like sincerity, happiness, and those small, precious memories, those bright moments people thought would last, often ended up buried beneath reality. And by the time someone realized how valuable they had been, they were already gone. Only then did people start looking back, wanting to fill that emptiness one more time, even while knowing they never truly could. Christina understood that. More than anyone, she wanted to protect moments like these. And even so, she still chose this path for his sake. The hatchling made up his mind. He would endure the pain. A few days later, inside a room overflowing with golden energy, magical patterns covered the floor. Christina walked forward with the hatchling and stepped into the center of the formation. The moment the hatchling felt its presence, his body trembled. Even from a distance, the surge of magic felt sharp, as though it were piercing directly into his body. Noticing his reaction, Christina gently reassured him and told him not to be nervous. The hatchling gathered himself and stepped into the formation. It was starting. Christina closed her eyes and focused. Then she began the inheritance spell. Calling upon her own name, she offered her life's accumulated knowledge and memories to be passed down to this child. Immediately, the patterns began flowing toward the hatchling. His eyes widened. Everything started pouring in. It felt as though endless information was being forced directly into his mind. His nerves struggled to adapt just to withstand the flood of knowledge. The magical patterns spread across his body and entered him. It hurt intensely, but he endured. As long as he held on, all of this knowledge and power would become his. Just a little more. Hold on. Hold on. Then, the hatchling pushed through the pain and accepted everything. Christina looked toward him in concern and called out to him. Was he all right? But suddenly his body gave out. The hatchling collapsed. Christina immediately rushed forward. She caught him in her arms and called to him anxiously. Please wake up. The hatchling weakly moved. Christina called for him again. Slowly, he held her hand, then opened his eyes just enough to look at her. She immediately realized he had endured it. With visible relief, she embraced him tightly. She thanked the goddess and told him he had done well. He had held on. Meanwhile, the hatchling quietly thought to himself. He had almost died. If he had been even slightly weaker, he would not have survived the inheritance spell. But Christina's mood brightened. She told him that it had been difficult and that he should recover his strength first. She had already prepared a special meal. The hatchling immediately focused on one word: food. After enduring something like that, he became curious about how good this special meal would be. But the moment he saw it, his excitement disappeared. Christina proudly presented medicinal herbs and a body-strengthening tonic. The hatchling stared at the meal in disappointment. Wouldn't milk and eggs have been better? Christina firmly refused. Those would interfere with the medicine. Then she revealed a candy apple and offered a reward if he finished everything. The hatchling thought for a moment. After everything he had gone through, fine. It wasn't like he was actually a real baby. He convinced himself. He had already eaten bitter mandragora before. How bad could this tiny medicine be? Then he took the first bite. His expression immediately changed. The bitterness hit instantly. Far too bitter. Christina understood how he felt, but insisted he still had to eat it. At the same time, she casually gave a snack to the phoenix. The hatchling stared in disbelief. At this point, this felt less like recovery and more like punishment for eating the mandragora. Meanwhile, the phoenix happily enjoyed its snack while he struggled through the medicine. He desperately wanted something good instead. Finally, Christina gave him the candy. She praised him for enduring everything and said it would help clear the aftertaste. The hatchling held it in both hands and slowly licked it. Immediately, relief returned. The sweetness softened the bitterness and made him feel alive again. Nearby, the phoenix curiously watched. The hatchling quietly pulled the bird away. Christina watched them and reflected silently. For a moment, she had worried she had misunderstood this child. She had been anxious, but seeing him now, nothing seemed wrong. It was a genuine relief. Then Christina remembered something. She joined her hands and mentioned that a guest would be arriving soon. She advised him not to reveal too much of his power. The hatchling paused. A child? Another hatchling? Christina gently placed her hand on his head. For someone barely over a month old to accept inheritance magic so completely, that was extraordinary. If he showed too much, it could raise unnecessary suspicion. Then she introduced the guest. His name was Perdition. He was the future elder of the Red Dragon clan. At that moment, a screen suddenly appeared before the hatchling. He looked at it in surprise. Name, Perdición. Species, Red Dragon hatchling. Attribute, fire. Age, 745 years. Special notes. The sole heir of the elder of the Red Dragons. After losing one parent, he had refined himself to become a proper future elder. Because of how firmly he suppressed his natural emotions, he was known as the Cold Flame. The hatchling stared at the information in silence. So, this was inheritance magic. The hatchling looked at the screen and quietly thought to himself. Judging by Christina's reaction, this display seemed to appear only for him. He reached out and touched it. The interface felt intuitive and easy to understand. Perfect. Now he wanted to see what else was hidden inside it. Before he could continue, Christina looked at him and mentioned that after using so much energy, he must still be hungry. With a wave of magic, she opened a portal. Inside were rows of milk bottles, phoenix eggs, and many other kinds of food she had prepared. The hatchling immediately rushed toward the food. Inheritance magic really was worth accepting. Meanwhile, Christina watched him quietly. Then she decided it was time. Even if it was a little early, they should start thinking about his name. While eating, the hatchling reflected. For dragons, names were important. Dragons chose their own names because a name became the first expression of the spirit of words, an ability unique to dragons. He thought for a moment. Using his old name exactly as before might sound awkward now. Even so, he had become attached to it. A memory surfaced. A mysterious person once looked at the small black imugi and gave him a name. Because his body resembled ink, that person called him Mook. Since his own surname was Lee, the name became Lee Mook. That person had smiled while touching the imugi's head and said that although he was tiny now, an imugi became a dragon after 1,000 years. Maybe one day, he would become a being capable of ruling the world. Until then, they should both keep moving forward and do their best. The memory faded. Back in the present, the hatchling quietly told Christina he would decide. Christina gently held his head and told him there was no rush. He could take his time. Then she sat down and commented on something else. The sound transmission magic was surprisingly clear. Wasn't it difficult? The hatchling admitted that it actually felt easy. Since speaking had always been difficult before, he felt lucky. Christina quietly reflected that even so, it was advanced magic and his adaptation speed was unbelievable. As expected, her child really was a genius. The hatchling heard all of it. Then he turned toward the phoenix. This little one needed a name, too. The phoenix chirped. Christina smiled. Perfect timing. Then she announced she would go greet Perdition. She asked if they wanted to come too. The hatchling thought for a moment. Christina was clearly excited, but meeting another hatchling would give him a useful comparison. So they went together. As they moved, the hatchling kept gathering information about this world. Many things felt familiar. Many felt completely different. But the most surprising thing was Christina. Information appeared before him. Name, Christina species, gold dragon attribute. Light, blessing, protection age, 3,345 years special notes. Elder of the Gold Dragons. Former Rod candidate. Owner of the dungeon. Fulfilled her duty as supervisor during the Celestial Demon War. Intervened in the human world and contributed to its recovery. The hatchling stared. Elder. Rod candidate. Celestial Demon War. Those were overwhelming titles. As Christina held his hand and walked forward while the phoenix rested on his head, he wondered how someone of that level had ended up raising him. Then Christina spoke ahead. They had already traveled a long way, and their guest must be tired. Soon, someone appeared. The hatchling recognized him. So this was Perdition, the heir of the Red Dragons. Perdition arrived together with his guardian and greeted Christina respectfully. Then his attention moved to the hatchling. So this was the recently born black dragon, Hatchling. The hatchling quietly held onto Christina's leg. Christina introduced him warmly. He was still young, but clever and unusually gifted. Then she encouraged the two children to get along. The hatchling raised his hand in response. Perdition stepped closer and crouched down. The hatchling suddenly felt something. He paused. What was that feeling? Then Perdition extended his hand as well. The feeling from earlier was that hostility? He thought back carefully. Whatever it was, Perdition had hidden it quickly. But something still felt strange. There was no reason for someone to glare at a hatchling they had only just met. Anyone watching would think they were sworn enemies. Then the hatchling paused. Lucky for him, he wasn't an ordinary hatchling. But wait, what? At that moment, the phoenix suddenly reacted. The little bird spread its wings, raised its crest, and let out a series of sharp cries while glaring at Perdition. Perdition looked toward it with confusion. Quietly, he muttered to himself, "What was that fluffy little creature?" Then he corrected himself and asked what kind of bird it was. It definitely didn't look ordinary. The hatchling heard that. Christina smiled and explained. The bird looked unusual because it was a phoenix hatchling. Perdition's expression immediately changed. A phoenix hatchling? But the phoenix of the previous generation was still alive. Christina admitted she had never seen something like this either. Still, that was the reality. Its powers had not awakened yet. So for now, she and Pacias were simply observing it. Perdition accepted the explanation and became quiet. The hatchling noticed immediately. The moment Pacia's name came up, his attitude changed. Christina gently touched Perdition's head and thanked him for coming all this way. Then she asked him to be a good older brother to the little one. Perdition calmly agreed. Watching this, the hatchling quietly thought a kid was still a kid. The moment Christina stopped patting him, he looked disappointed. Those were the thoughts of the youngest hatchling in the room. But still, that earlier look remained stuck in his mind. Maybe he should test him. The hatchling moved closer. Perdition looked at him with confusion and asked what he was doing. Without hesitation, the hatchling raised both hands and placed them on Perdition's head. Just a quick touch. From the outside, it looked harmless. Adults did things like this all the time. But if someone you disliked touched your head, anyone would react. So he waited. Let's see your reaction. Perdition immediately became flustered and demanded to know what he thought he was doing. His face changed slightly. The hatchling blinked. That wasn't the reaction he expected. Wait, did he not actually hate him? Still unconvinced, the hatchling grabbed Perdition's hand. He was sure there had been hostility earlier. One more test. Before Perdition could react, the hatchling jumped straight toward him. Perdition tried to stop him, but the hatchling wrapped himself around him in a sudden hug. If this didn't get a reaction, nothing would. Both of them lost balance and fell together. Christina was startled. She hurried over and asked if they were all right. Then she apologized and explained that the little one was probably just excited to finally have an older brother. The hatchling stayed quiet. Meanwhile, Christina looked at them again and asked if anyone was hurt. The hatchling froze. "He protected me?" Perdition looked toward him awkwardly and tried to thank him for catching him before quickly changing the subject and asking if he was all right. The hatchling dismissed it immediately. Perdition turned away and told him to get off. Watching him, the hatchling quietly realized something. Just a moment ago, he had looked worried. Now he was acting cold again. After stepping away, the hatchling reached a conclusion. Forget the hostility. This wasn't hostility at all. He was embarrassed. Was he really someone who couldn't be honest about his own feelings? At his age? Then again, the hatchling admitted he could understand where that came from. Perdition composed himself and explained that the hatchling was still too young to properly process everything yet. Even so, he shouldn't behave like that with just anyone. The hatchling looked over at Christina. She seemed happy, maybe even a little charmed. Perdition quietly looked at the hatchling and commented on how small he was. Christina smiled and reminded him that he used to be tiny too, though admittedly, he had still been bigger than the little one. Perdition looked at his own hands. He couldn't imagine himself like that. Christina smiled again. It had been too long ago. Of course he wouldn't remember. Then she looked at him warmly. They rarely met now, but she remembered clearly. Back then, he had been such a sweet child. Perdition quietly looked away. The hatchling noticed the atmosphere. Then, that strange feeling returned. His stomach suddenly growled. Everyone turned and looked at him. The hatchling became embarrassed. He knew it was probably because he had exhausted too much mana, but after eating that much, how was he still hungry? What kind of stomach did this body even have? Christina lightly told them to play together while she went to get food. Perdition nodded and reminded the hatchling not to overdo it. The hatchling watched Christina leave. She really just left like that. Once she was gone, Perdition immediately called out to him. The hatchling paused. Straight to business? Was the serious act fake all along? Perdition sat down and grabbed the hatchling's cheeks. Looking directly at him, he quietly acknowledged that this little one was apparently the younger dragon he would be guiding from now on. The hatchling immediately got annoyed and tried to pull away. The phoenix reacted too and started protesting. Perdition glanced toward it and calmly told it to stay out of the conversation. Then he looked back at the hatchling. Everything could be left to him. He wouldn't go easy just because he was young. So slacking off wasn't an option. The hatchling stared. Teach him? Teach him what exactly? If anything, shouldn't he be the one teaching? He had already received inheritance magic. What exactly was he supposed to do with this red kid? Perdition let out a quiet breath and looked toward the phoenix. The bird was floating in the air, and small traces of fire had started appearing around it. Perdition looked unimpressed. For a bird, it had quite a lot of nerve. Then, he began drawing in fire energy. Not aggressively, but enough to make his point. Someone who would become leader of the fire clan wasn't someone a bird should challenge. The hatchling watched carefully. Perdition was clearly holding back. But hatchling or not, a phoenix was still a phoenix. Perdition reacted immediately. The hatchling realized where this was heading. At this rate, both of them would get hurt. The phoenix cried out. The hatchling smiled. That little bird wasn't an ordinary bird. Then, he stepped directly between them and blocked the tension. After looking at both of them, he quietly declared, that bird was his subordinate. The hatchling stepped forward without hesitation. Raising one small paw, he released a burst of fire energy from his own body, pushing back Perdition's attack and shielding the little white phoenix behind him. He stood firmly in front of the bird and calmly declared that the phoenix was his subordinate. Perdition stared at him in surprise. The hatchling remained motionless, protecting the frightened bird behind his back. Perdition frowned and insisted that the little bird did not belong to him. Hearing that, the hatchling immediately became concerned. He firmly stated that the phoenix was his familiar and warned Perdition not to harm it. As Perdition continued his attack, The hatchling effortlessly blocked him while protecting the bird. Seeing that, Perdition was visibly shocked. The hatchling quietly thought to himself. Just as he expected, no matter how important Perdition's status was, he was already under Christina's protection. Anyone who tried to harm him inside her lair would not simply be thrown out. They would have to face Christina's wrath. She might be gentle by nature, but this red dragon, hatchling, clearly didn't understand his limits. Perdition mocked him for trying to protect his little follower. The hatchling sighed inwardly. This brat still hadn't learned his lesson. Maybe it was time to teach him one. He couldn't help wondering what kind of training the Red Dragon Elder had given this child. For a moment, he considered ignoring the situation and simply playing along. Meanwhile, the frightened phoenix stayed close behind him. The hatchling quickly changed his mind. No, he couldn't ignore it. Since they would be spending plenty of time together from now on, it would be better to establish proper boundaries while Perdition was still young. The little dragon gently put the phoenix down before stepping toward Perdition. Watching him approach, Perdition couldn't understand what he was planning. Then the hatchling calmly announced that it was time to establish the hierarchy. Perdición froze. The moment he felt the hatchling's aura, overwhelming pressure, crash down on him. He couldn't understand what was happening. His body stiffened, his breathing became difficult, and an unfamiliar pressure weighed heavily on him. The hatchling accomplished all of it using nothing but his own aura. After letting the pressure settle for a moment, he snapped his fingers. Only then did Perdition finally catch his breath again. Satisfied, the hatchling concluded that was enough. It seemed Perdition understood now. Still shaken, Perdition demanded to know what the hatchling had just done and questioned how someone so young could possess such an overwhelming aura. The hatchling quietly evaluated him. Despite all his arrogance, his mental resistance was surprisingly weak. Then again, comparing him to someone who had trained his mind for more than 900 years as an imugi wasn't exactly fair. No matter how fiercely Perdition glared now, he looked more like a frightened wild animal than an enemy. Even so, his earlier use of magic showed sharp instincts. He was like a cowardly lion, timid in some ways, but undeniably talented. The hatchling realized that Perdition had likely received nothing but strict successor training, leaving him emotionally underdeveloped. Holding the little phoenix in his arms, another realization came to him. Perhaps this was why Christina couldn't truly become Perdition's friend. Maybe that was exactly why she wanted the two of them to become playmates. Winning the favor of a future elder would benefit him as well. Besides, after everything he had observed, Perdition wasn't a bad child. He was simply inexperienced and awkward. He seemed like the type who would never abandon someone once he truly opened his heart. First, however, the hatchling needed him to lower his guard. He walked closer and grabbed Perdition's clothes while quietly forming a plan. If he pretended that protecting the phoenix had been nothing more than an accident caused by a hatchling losing control of his aura, then acted completely discouraged afterward, it would appear perfectly natural. After all, hatchlings often struggled to control their power. Still, he wondered how he should build a friendship. The easiest solution would be to dominate Perdition and force him to obey. But doing that would expose the inheritance magic he had received. More importantly, Perdition's habit of looking down on the weak clearly came from harsh successor training. Honestly, the hatchling felt like revoking the boy's guardian license and lecturing him himself, especially since Christina was far more qualified as a guardian. Just then, a blue portal opened behind him. Christina stepped out carrying a basket. Smiling warmly, she commented that it looked like she would have to do the hard work herself before asking whether the children had been getting along. Perdition curiously looked at the basket and asked what she had brought. Christina happily explained that it was a special treat because the little hatchling absolutely loved it, then invited Perdition to have some as well. He politely accepted. The hatchling's eyes immediately lit up at the sight of the food. Without waiting another moment, he and the little phoenix rushed toward the meal and eagerly began eating. Watching them, Perdition quietly examined the food with curiosity. Christina smiled and remarked that her little hatchling loved it very much. Christina explained that the hatchling loved food infused with mana. Perdition found that strange. Hatchlings normally never lacked mana, so he couldn't understand why this little dragon insisted on eating mana-infused food unless there was some hidden reason. After thinking it over, he dismissed the idea, assuming the hatchling simply had unusual tastes. Lost in thought, he suddenly felt something poking his leg. Looking down, he saw the hatchling holding out a piece of food, inviting him to stop overthinking and just eat. With an awkward smile, Perdition accepted it and took a bite. The hatchling immediately watched his reaction before offering him another piece, realizing that Perdition clearly enjoyed it. Quietly, The hatchling concluded that feeding him would make it much harder for him to stay hostile. Besides, sweets naturally improved anyone's mood, and seeing Perdition happily enjoying them made him look like an ordinary child. Watching those honest reactions reminded the hatchling that children should naturally laugh when food was delicious and feel disappointed when it was gone. He reflected that there were two kinds of dishonest people. The first were those who lied out of habit and chose deception for themselves. The second were those forced into self-denial by their surroundings. Unlike the first group, the second could still change if someone sincerely cared for them, shared what they had, and acknowledged feelings that had long been ignored. No one was born perfect. Since he had once received help from others himself, he decided this child deserved at least one chance. If it still didn't work afterward, then there would be nothing more he could do. Besides, earning the trust of the future Red Dragon Elder would only benefit him in the future. Making up his mind, the hatchling happily continued sharing all of his food and drinks with Perdition, smiling innocently as he handed them over. Step by step, he planned to lower the boy's guard. The environment was already changing since they would continue meeting here. Christina was more than capable of guiding him, and the Phoenix listened to the hatchling. Now all he had to do was help the two of them interact naturally. As Perdition continued eating, the hatchling walked over with another snack. This time, Perdition noticed it was only half a cookie and questioned why he was being given a broken one. The hatchling gestured for him to break it into even smaller pieces because the little Phoenix wanted some too. The bird immediately rushed over at full speed, eager for a share. Perdition sighed, wondering why he had to do something so tedious. The hatchling simply looked at him with sad eyes. Unable to ignore that expression, Perdition reluctantly broke the cookie apart and offered some to the Phoenix. The hatchling quietly praised him, thinking that this was exactly how an older brother should treat someone younger. The Phoenix hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to accept the food. The hatchling silently urged it to eat, knowing his entire plan would fall apart if the bird refused. After receiving an intense glare from the hatchling, the little Phoenix finally accepted the snack. Watching the three children together, Christina smiled warmly, delighted that they were already getting along so well. Perdition awkwardly denied that anything special was happening. The hatchling looked around at everyone and couldn't help smiling. For the first time in a long while, the atmosphere around him felt genuinely warm. Compared to his previous life, this place already felt like home. He had once planned to leave, but now he found himself wanting to stay. Perdition quietly admitted that the little ones certainly had good taste. He then explained that his father had instructed him to help guide the future candidate of the Dark Dragons and politely asked whether he could return the next day. Christina immediately welcomed the idea. Perdition promised he would come back tomorrow since today's visit had only been an introduction. Christina offered to walk him out. Surrounded by golden light, the two of them rose into the air. Before leaving, Perdition told the hatchling that he would see him tomorrow, and the hatchling waved him goodbye. As they departed, Christina asked what he thought of Perdition. After thinking for a moment, the hatchling replied that the boy was polite but dishonest. Curious, Christina asked why. The hatchling explained that Perdition became angry whenever he was frightened and constantly pretended to dislike the things he actually enjoyed. To him, Perdition resembled a wounded cat. Christina quietly understood. She believed it was probably because the boy had never been allowed to live for anything except becoming the next elder. The hatchling yawned and muttered that Perdition had already announced he would return tomorrow, even though it felt like he had only just left. Looking back, he realized Christina had been right. Perdition wasn't truly the type to hurt a tiny bird. If he had been, Christina would never have trusted them together. Christina then shared her own guess. The Phoenix possessed the same elemental affinity as Perdition, yet it wasn't as familiar and followed only the hatchling. Combined with its tremendous potential, Perdition had likely instinctively recognized it as something extraordinary and become cautious. She asked the hatchling to help him lower that guard. The hatchling agreed. Thinking everything through, he realized Perdition had probably sensed his own extraordinary talent from the beginning as well. Having lost a parent while carrying the burden of becoming the next elder, the boy had likely spent his entire life suppressing his emotions to meet everyone's expectations. Based on everything he had learned through transmission magic and his own observations, the hatchling believed he finally understood Perdition. It seemed that teaching this future elder how to live normally might become part of his own dragon life. The following day, Perdition returned. Even when the little Phoenix greeted him warmly, he remained reserved, warning it not to become too attached because it would be better that way. The hatchling couldn't help wondering why the boy's mood changed so dramatically from one moment to the next. Perdition then explained that he had come early because he wanted to give the hatchling something before starting their lesson. He took out a ring and handed it over. It was a transformation artifact containing polymorph magic. Since Christina had told him the hatchling possessed exceptional intelligence, Perdition believed communicating in human form would make future lessons much easier. He explained that it was an artifact he had used himself when he was younger and assured the hatchling that it would automatically adjust to fit. The hatchling slipped it on. Following Perdition's instructions, he imagined the form he wanted while channeling mana into the artifact. Aura immediately swirled around his body. Moments later, the hatchling transformed into an adorable young boy. Even Perdition was briefly speechless. As he gently rubbed the boy's head, the hatchling smiled brightly. Seeing that innocent smile, Perdition quietly looked away, unable to hide his embarrassment.
A dragon's true name is the very proof of its existence. Knowing another dragon's true name doesn't grant complete control over them, but certain ancient authorities and binding contracts can only function through a true name. Giving someone that name is essentially allowing them to interfere with your life. The hatchling immediately realizes why only a parent would ever be trusted with something so important. From his perspective, Perdition seems to be trying to learn his true name before he's old enough to understand its significance. Trying to ease his concerns, Perdition explains that even if it isn't his true name, the hatchling should at least start thinking about what to call himself, just as he and Christina have names. He adds that although everyone knows him as Perdition, his actual true name is much longer. The hatchling notes that even Perdition keeps his own true name hidden and wonders if he needs to test him again. Before he can decide, Perdition makes an unexpected proposal. If the hatchling reveals his true name, he'll reveal his own in return. The offer catches the hatchling completely off guard. Perdition calmly explains that among dragons, exchanging true names is proof of complete trust and absolute loyalty. Since they're going to become brothers, he thinks it's only natural. The hatchling casually agrees, though his flat reaction leaves Perdition visibly disappointed. Watching him carefully, the hatchling realizes something. If this had been Passius's order, there was no way Perdition would have suggested such an equal exchange. That means this idea belongs entirely to him. Which raises another question. Why is he in such a hurry? Then it suddenly clicks. The hatchling asks if Perdition simply wants them to become sworn brothers as soon as possible. Perdition immediately becomes flustered. Blushing bright red, he awkwardly denies trying to rush anything. Seeing his reaction, the hatchling immediately concludes that the answer is obvious. Trying to hide his embarrassment, Perdition hurriedly insists that the hatchling simply doesn't understand how valuable it is to have the future elder's successor as an ally. However, the more he talks, the more he ends up rambling about things the hatchling never even asked. Watching the awkward explanation, the hatchling can't help realizing he's completely embarrassed. Before the conversation can become any more awkward, Bikia reacts beside them. Using the interruption as an excuse to change the subject, Perdition quickly drops the discussion about names. Since the hatchling has already named the little phoenix, he decides it's time to continue today's lesson. He then begins explaining that dragons are a race known as the origin of the very elements that make up the world. Because dragons stand at the origin of the world's elements, they can wield word magic, a power that grants the root of existence and sets the beginning of destiny. Perdition explains that the moment the hatchling named the little phoenix Bikia he opened a new path for its future. He warns the hatchling to be careful with promises made in his own name because no one can predict what kind of destiny those words might create. The hatchling quietly reflects on the idea of creating destiny. Ironically, that had once been his greatest strength. In his previous life, he spent 1,000 years cultivating himself and building a destiny worthy of ascension, only to have everything destroyed by a human who wouldn't even live 100 years. Thinking back on it, he can't help wondering if something like that should have been possible at all. Destiny is supposed to demand equivalent exchange. Humans can sometimes alter destiny because their short lives are filled with countless choices and turning points. But becoming a divine beast means creating countless inevitabilities until they form a transcendent flow. Very few beings can ever walk that path, and once such a destiny begins flowing, it shouldn't be easy to change. Yet somehow, his destiny had been shattered. Looking down, the hatchling admits he still has regrets, but dwelling on the past won't give him any answers. His thoughts are interrupted when Perdition calls out, asking if he's even listening. The hatchling quickly assures him that he is. To test him, Perdition tells him to repeat what he just said. The hatchling summarizes it as becoming an elder through overwhelming power power and fear that keeps everyone beneath you under control. Even as he repeats it, he realizes the philosophy feels completely outdated. Satisfied that he had been listening, Perdikian explains that true authority comes from an overwhelming gap in strength and fear. A ruler must crush others so completely that they never even think about defying them. The hatchling understands that such thinking may have suited Pasias, who belonged to a generation shaped by war, but it doesn't fit Perdikian at all. He wonders how he can change that mindset when Perdikian probably wouldn't listen to direct criticism. Instead, he quietly asks whether living that way has ever made him feel lonely. Perdikian pauses in confusion. The hatchling explains that although his brother is undoubtedly strong, people who follow only because of fear may obey him, but they'll remain nothing more than subordinates. When he's struggling or hurting, they won't truly share his burdens. He gently points toward Bikia. Although the little phoenix is technically his subordinate, it freely expresses its feelings and never hides what's on its mind. From everything Perdikian described, it sounds like he doesn't have anyone like that. Perdikian hesitates before quietly admitting that things could never be that simple between himself and those living in his lair. Watching his reaction, the hatchling finally understands. That way of thinking has been drilled into him for years. Still, he reminds himself not to judge Pasias too quickly. Intelligent people are rarely one-dimensional. A loving father can still be cruel to others, and even the ancient tale of a god stealing fire for humanity can be seen as the story of a traitor from another perspective. People always have more than one side. The same must be true for the boy standing before him. The hatchling also realizes that Christina deliberately introduced Perdikian to him. That alone means she believes he isn't beyond saving. Rather than trying to change him all at once, he'll have to slowly broaden his perspective. Curious, the hatchling asks whether someone taught him that philosophy. Perdikian immediately answers that he learned it from his father, Lord Pasias. To him, Pasias is a steadfast and upright leader, capable, determined, and someone anyone would willingly follow. The hatchling smiles to himself. If someone only accepted the admirable parts of Christina's inherited knowledge, that was exactly the image they'd see. However, the complete picture Christina passed down is different. The wars shaped Pasias into someone who constantly judged everyone around him. Anyone who failed to meet his standards was cast aside, while everyone else was forced to follow his path. Even if his ideals were noble, he was still the kind of man who would use any means necessary to achieve them. Outwardly, however, the hatchling simply nods and remarks that Pasias truly sounds like an incredible person. Perdikian agrees without hesitation, proudly admitting that even he deeply respects his father's achievement. Perdikian looked down at him with a serious expression and quietly asked whether he actually liked having a brother like him. Before the hatchling could answer, Perdikian frowned slightly, dismissed the question as unnecessary, and announced that it was time to resume their magic lesson. He told the hatchling to stop chatting and focus. The hatchling simply agreed. Privately, he thought that pretending not to notice Perdikian's obvious discomfort was becoming exhausting. Even without an answer, the expression on the young dragon's face had already said everything. From that day onward, Perdikian continued visiting regularly to teach him. During their intensive training, the hatchling eventually mastered telepathy, making their daily communication much smoother, although his rapid progress left Perdikian increasingly suspicious. Even so, their lessons advanced far faster than before, leading Perdikian to quietly wonder whether his young student might actually be a genius. One day, standing confidently with his arms crossed, Perdikian announced that they would practice a technique called the Mana Cat's Cradle. Curious, the hatchling repeated the name. Perdikian decided to demonstrate first and instructed him to watch carefully. Golden threads of mana flowed between his fingers as he skillfully wove them into an intricate geometric pattern. He explained that the key was maintaining a perfectly uniform thickness throughout the mana string. Although it looked simple, it became surprisingly difficult once someone actually tried it, so complete concentration was essential. The hatchling carefully began manipulating the glowing mana threads with his tiny claws. As he worked, he realized the exercise felt almost identical to the string games he had played during his previous life. Watching those smooth movements, Perdikian looked down suspiciously and asked whether this was really the hatchling's first attempt. The hatchling broke into a slight sweat before insisting that it truly was his first time in this life. Privately, however, he admitted that he had practiced something remarkably similar in his previous one. Perdikian could only stare in disbelief. Meanwhile, the hatchling happily continued weaving increasingly complex patterns, genuinely impressed by whoever had designed this magical training. It cleverly transformed the familiar patterns of a children's string game into the foundation of functional magic circles. The exercises were organized perfectly by difficulty, making the entire learning process surprisingly enjoyable. The only regret he had was that bringing the pattern guide might have made everything look a little too easy. Looking up from the glowing threads, the hatchling asked whether Elder Passias had taught Perditian this technique. Perditian hesitated before quietly correcting him. It wasn't his father. His mother, Kuzuna, had been the one who taught him. The hatchling immediately noticed how naturally Perditian referred to his mother. Whenever the conversation involved her, his emotional guard became noticeably lower. Closing his eyes thoughtfully, the hatchling realized that this probably explained why Perditian had gradually become more lenient toward him. Beneath his sharp personality was someone driven by empathy and the lingering pain of losing someone precious. Seeing an opportunity, the hatchling innocently asked what Lady Kuzuna had been like. Perditian looked slightly surprised by the question. The hatchling explained that he knew almost nothing about what parents were supposed to be like. Christina avoided discussing such topics for his sake, so he genuinely wanted to hear about someone who still remembered their mother. Perditian quietly understood. After a brief pause, he began speaking. His mother had been an incredibly gentle and kind person. He described her magnificent dragon form, with shimmering silver scales and brilliant purple eyes soaring gracefully through the sky. Remembering her human form, he recalled her long silver hair, her warm smile, and how she loved caring for small birds in peaceful meadows. She loved birds so much that she had chosen to build her dragon lair beside the phoenix's nesting ground. She also loved to sing. More than anything else, what remained in Perditian's memory were the lullabies she used to sing to him when he was young. The hatchling quietly repeated the word singing to himself. Perditian nodded, explaining that those lullabies had never faded from his heart because they were songs lovingly sung by a mother to her own child. Looking slightly melancholy, Perditian admitted that he should remember much more about his mother, but time had blurred those memories. Since he rarely looked back on them, even the melodies of her lullabies had begun to fade. Seeing that vulnerable side of him, the hatchling realized this was the perfect moment to gently reach out. Looking up, he sincerely said he would love to hear one of those lullabies someday. Perditian's face instantly turned red. Embarrassed, he looked away and awkwardly denied ever singing. Crossing his arms, he explained that he didn't have the luxury to waste time on things like that because every moment had to be devoted to becoming a worthy elder. The hatchling sighed inwardly, realizing just how stubborn Perditian was. Since reasoning alone wouldn't work, he decided to appeal to his emotions instead. He quietly explained that he only wanted to hear the song because it clearly meant so much to Perditian. Having never heard a lullaby himself, he wondered what kind of warmth was hidden within a song lovingly left behind by a mother. Deep down, the hatchling knew he wasn't simply trying to persuade his teacher. He remembered the heartfelt words left behind by someone who had believed he was already dead, wishing for nothing more than his happiness. Listening to Perditian's stories had made him realize how deeply Lady Kuzuna loved her son. Even without meeting her, he found himself wondering whether that unconditional affection was what having parents truly felt like. Those sincere words softened Perditian's expression, and he quietly admitted that perhaps the hatchling was right. The hatchling silently realized that if Perditian ever compared his loving mother with his strict father under the same title of parent, he would eventually recognize the contradiction himself. Although he respected the elder and called him a great man, he could never truly place that cruel figure beside the gentle woman who had raised him. That contradiction would eventually force him to confront the truth. At that moment, painful memories resurfaced. He remembered the elder coldly calling him a pathetic fool and questioning why he was wasting time on such meaningless things. The elder mocked Lady Kuzuna's way of raising him, ridiculed him for singing instead of training, and warned that such weakness would only turn him into Lourdes's puppet. He even claimed that everyone under Perditian's future leadership would eventually die because they had been spoiled by peace, before cruelly declaring that it would have been better if a failure like him had never been born. Those merciless words scarred the young dragon deeply. From that day onward, Perditian convinced himself that those without strength had no right to speak, and that seeking personal happiness was nothing more than running away from responsibility. Unable to defend defend his mother's honor, he drove himself beyond every limit, training relentlessly without even allowing himself proper hibernation, all to earn his father's approval. In the end, by suppressing every emotion that made him seem weak and cutting himself off from others, he gained recognition but lost the path he had once followed. The hatchling understood that even after finally earning his father's approval, Perdition still couldn't smile. Deep inside, he had already begun believing that none of it truly mattered anymore. Breaking the silence, the hatchling gently asked whether he had never felt hurt by everything that had happened. Perdition looked down quietly before thanking him. He admitted that the request had come at the right time because he had been worried the hatchling might be feeling lonely. Taking a slow breath, he confessed that it had been a very long time since he had last sung, so his voice might sound a little awkward. The hatchling blinked in surprise, genuinely excited that Perdition had agreed. Closing his eyes, Perdition softly began singing the lullaby his mother had once sung to him. The gentle melody spoke of a home longing for the open sky, where tired wings could finally rest in peace after a long journey. As the song continued, the hatchling listened carefully and couldn't help being amazed. Not only had Perdition agreed to sing, he was an exceptionally beautiful singer. The soothing melody continues as Perdition sings about embracing the beauty of the sunset, carrying one's wishes in the heart, and walking peacefully along a path lined with blooming red roses. As the song flows into verses about discovering the mystery of a blue door and preparing a warm meal within a maze of memories, the hatchling suddenly senses something unusual. This isn't an ordinary lullaby. Mana begins flowing through the air in a steady rhythm, perfectly synchronized with the song. As he listens to the gentle lyrics wishing for a loving heart to reach its destination and find a peaceful place to rest, the hatchling realizes the melody itself is a form of word magic. Before he can fully process it, an overwhelming wave of drowsiness washes over him. He desperately struggles to stay awake, fighting against the unnatural sleep pulling at his consciousness. Seeing his little student suddenly swaying, Perdition immediately stops singing and asks what happened. Unable to resist the spell any longer, the hatchling stumbles forward, weakly calls out for Christina, and collapses into a deep sleep before the startled Perdition. The scene then shifts to a peaceful balcony overlooking a quiet landscape. Inside a cozy bedroom decorated with soft blue flowers, the hatchling sleeps soundly in his black dragon form, curled up beside Bikia on a fluffy white pillow. After some time, he slowly opens one bright crimson eye. Stretching beneath the blankets, he realizes he had slept incredibly deeply. Thinking back, he concludes that Perdition's lullaby was actually a form of word magic created to comfort and soothe guests. Looking at the glowing blue status window floating before him, he jokingly compares the spell to a powerful tranquilizer, wondering how dragons could turn even lullabies into such overwhelming magic. Curious, he hopes he'll eventually learn the technique himself once he grows stronger. As he remembers falling asleep in the middle of Perdition's song, a familiar chirping interrupts his thought. Turning around, he finds Rai happily rubbing against his cheek. Smiling, the hatchling guesses Christina must have sent Rai to watch over him and notices the little spirit seems unusually cheerful. Moments later, golden light fills the room as Christina gently descends beside him. With a warm smile, she tells him he's finally awake and points out that Bikia is still sleeping peacefully. She then suggests they step outside to talk. The hatchling agrees, allowing Christina to carry him outside while leaving Bikia tucked comfortably beneath the blankets. Under the quiet night sky, he steps onto the grass and transforms into his human form. Watching him with a gentle smile, Christina explains what happened after he fell asleep. Perdition had rushed back carrying both him and Bikia, looking completely flustered. She suggests reassuring him tomorrow since he was genuinely worried. The hatchling smiles to himself, realizing Perdition is much softer than he pretends to be. As they sit together on the grass, Christina hands him a bag of chocolate chip cookies and asks how today's lesson went. While enjoying the treats, he explains that everything had been normal until Perdition suddenly sang the lullaby his mother, Lady Kuzuna, used to sing. Hearing Kuzuna's name, Christina falls into thought. The hatchling quietly realizes this is the perfect opportunity and innocently asks if he can learn that sleeping magic as well. Christina explains that word magic isn't something learned through formulas. It naturally forms when someone's sincere feelings become one with the words they understand best. Gently patting his head, she assures him he'll understand it when the time comes. Since he had slept so long, the hatchling asks if he can stay outside a little longer. Instead of refusing, Christina hands him a yellow candy and explains that she engraved a teleportation spell inside it. If he bites it, he'll instantly return to his bedroom. The hatchling can't help wondering why anyone would hide teleportation magic inside candy, but Christina simply reminds him how much he likes sweets before telling him not to wander too far. After she leaves, he lies back on the grassy hill beneath the moonlit sky, surrounded by drifting fireflies. As he reaches toward the moon, he pieces everything together. Word magic doesn't rely on fixed formulas. It depends entirely on natural talent, personal understanding, and genuine conviction. Realizing that, he decides he'll eventually help Perdition awaken his own hidden potential once they've built enough trust. With that plan in mind, and with Christina and Rai's help, he begins preparing tomorrow's lesson. The next morning, bright sunlight fills the lair. The hatchling wakes early and finds Christina in the kitchen wearing an apron. She happily offers him freshly baked chestnut bread, and after taking a bite, he sincerely admires her cooking. Christina then hands him the supplies he requested the previous night and lets him know that Perdition has already arrived. Excited that everything is ready, the hatchling rushes outside to meet the waiting red-haired dragon and happily announces that today's lesson will begin with a picnic.